Good afternoon, everybody. Tim Noka here. I'm going to go ahead and sit second chair. In a moment, I'm going to introduce your presenter for the day, the really smart person in the room, who is Kay Corey Aubrey. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us a little bit of your lunch. It's greatly appreciated. We expect this webinar to go until about 12:30 with content, and we will, Kay and I will stay afterwards until every last question has been answered. Kay Aubrey has spent over 25 years as a user experience researcher. Kay helps her clients understand their end users' needs and their goals so that they can design better products. She specializes in usability testing and face-to-face ethnographic consumer research. In addition to providing qualitative research, she trains teams in usability testing, UX research, and user interface design. Kay is an editor, a trainer, and a RIVA certified master focus group moderator. So with that, I give you all Kay Corey Aubrey, and again, with our thanks that you came, and thanks to you, Kay, for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, for giving me this opportunity to speak to such a wonderful group of people. And RIVA is the Riva Market Training Institute in Rockville, Maryland. They train qualitative researchers. So let's take it away here. The topic of this webinar for the next half hour is going to focus on how to integrate usability into software development. But what I'm going to do is a lot of what I'm going to be telling you is really, kind of general, regardless of the environment, but I'm going to pitch this presentation towards software development. Now, this is what we're going to talk about, and we're really, because this is such a vast topic, I'm really going to, kind of just give you an overview, and Tim and his team are going to make these slides available to you afterwards so that you can look at them in more depth. But these are the topics that I'm going to cover as an overview. What is user experience / usability research? What are the key things you need to get right with this type of research to create a usable product or service? Practical strategies that a software development team can use to leverage to gain acceptance for this new process in their organization. We're going to talk a little bit about the value of starting with practical methods such as usability testing and user walkthroughs. I'll show you what those are. We're going to talk about matching the UX research method to your stage of software development. And in a lot of ways, the usability process parallels the software development lifecycle in a lot of ways. And I'm going to be pointing out those, those points of where they kind of meet this, where you're basically doing very similar types of activities, except with maybe a little bit more rigor and method so that you can really focus on the end user needs. And then finally, throughout, I'll be talking about how to integrate UX usability into your software development process. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of background. What is usability research? And in my mind, UX and usability basically mean the same thing. So I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. But what is this type of research? For people who are business analysts, a lot of what I'm going to say to you probably will sound very, very familiar, and that being that you already have a lot of the basic skills of the usability researcher. Now, one key aspect of UX research is learning the end user's what we call mental model for how a process works. So the reason that's important is whenever you're going to automate anything and you care about the end user, you care about your technology being intuitive, one of the first things that you really need to get to nail down very accurately is how do your users today in the analog world think about the process for how this particular technology works. So I'm going to give you an example here. Suppose you were building a house and the contractor came up to you and said, okay, you have a choice of 3 different kinds of thermostats that I could install in your house. Which of these 3 do you want me to put in? Older people might pick this first model here because this is what they grew up with. And it's tactile and it's, to them, very approachable. So you basically turn this little knob here, to the temperature that you want. And what this meter down here shows you is the current temperature in the room where this thermometer is. And for people who are familiar with this design, it makes total sense. They may want to stay with it. So folks who are perhaps a little bit more comfortable with technology, maybe they have a smartphone and they understand smart devices, they're not scared by them, they might go with the Nest. And their mental model of how the Nest works is, you know, you basically install the thing, it takes readings in the environment, it just, you know, and when people are around, and it automatically adjusts on its own without a lot of intervention. However, if you want to make any intervention, you can do that through your smartphone. So that would be the user's mental model for how the Nest works. Now, this third kind here would be perhaps somebody who might have grown up with this type of thermostat in their house, so they're not scared by it. But the mental model here might appeal to somebody who's, say, more detail-oriented, more structured. They like having complete control. They love the structure. And, you know, how you go in and up front, you have to say, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, this is the schedule, and I want to have these temperatures across the week. So this is a very different, the person who understands how this works, they have a very different, they have an accurate mental model how this particular model works. They may not understand how this model works or this model works, and vice versa across all three designs. But anyway, the upshot is, as a usability researcher, as a UX researcher, again, mean the same thing, one of your first missions is to figure out who is your end user and how do they think? What is their mental model for how this process works today? Now, another defining characteristic of user experience is the fact that there's always some sort of theme of a user journey. And that user journey can be as expansive as, like in this case, what this diagram here is showing you, a customer journey. Or it could be something very focused, like doing a particular task. But there's always that concept of a linear progression, and you need, and in order to be able to understand the user, you have to understand their journey. And you have to understand all the touch points and what they do within each touch point. So let me spend a moment on this diagram here so that you'll understand it a little bit better. I put this together. It's a hypothetical customer journey for somebody who is a prosumer photographer. And this is the journey of that person's development of skills and how they move through, you know, basically the journey of being, you know, a very skilled amateur photographer. So if you were to do user research here, you know, talk with ranked beginners, understand what their point of view is, how do they interact with the company, what kind of gear do they use, and you would capture all that. You might talk with, you know, 10 people who fit this category and learn a tremendous amount about their mindset, their mental models, how they interact with products, what are their expectations of those products. And that would give an awful lot of insight into how those early stage products should be designed, what kind of services that the company should offer. So again, it's kind of thinking in very detail about who the end user is, what is their journey. As they move through their development, you know, maybe after a year or so, they become the master of the basics in photography. So they learn about aperture, they learn about exposure, these sort of basic concepts. They learn about you know, lenses and, you know, more expensive gear. And so these are more opportunities for the company to sell them stuff and to provide other services that will create a stronger relationship. The next stage might be passionate hobbyist, where they're really becoming, you know, they're able to use that photography as a means of self-expression. And again, similar kinds of things you'd be looking for in the UX area in terms of learning about the user, all the way up to the prosumer, which is where, you know, they might be actually making money off their skill set. But as the UX researcher, these are the types of things you'd be focusing on, and these are the kinds of questions that people ask given their stage of understanding of photography. These are the pain points they experience as they evolve. And here are opportunities for the company. So you can kind of see where user experience in a general sort of way is applied to the business. There's always a business need for this type of thing that helps to focus it. And the linear progression and this approach would apply to software development as much as it applies to any kind of product or service development. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that you do as a UX researcher is you identify who are the most important end users. And this is really, really important because you cannot design for everybody. So you need to look at the universe of all possible users, and based on your insights that you gain over time, you segment these users. So you're gaining insight, but you're also talking with the team and getting their perspective and the organizational perspective, as well as understanding in a deeper sense the business objectives. Now, identifying these key end users, that's called persona research. So UX researchers are also very skilled in doing this type of research and producing, consumable information, which I'll show you in a minute, on each persona. And again, you'd be looking at things that we've talked about. What is their journey? What are their tasks? What are their objectives? Things like that, so that you know everything about these personas. And these personas are abstract. They're not real people, but they're kind of typical for typical representation of that type of user. So let's take a look a little bit in a little more detail about what is a persona. So this particular template here comes from a great book called Communicating Design, and I use it a lot in my work because it's really succinct and my clients love it. But basically, this would be zeroing in on one type of user, and that might be Raj, perhaps the guy that I built that customer journey map around. So if you notice the categories of information that I would capture as a UX researcher in my persona research, I'd be interested in Raj's behaviors along dimensions that are very specific to this type of product. I would, through my talking with people, interviewing them, going to their house, going to their workplace, whatever context is relevant, I would put together typical scenarios of use here. So these are really, really helpful to the people who are developing the product. In the software development lifecycle, knowing this kind of information would really help you to pinpoint what are the requirements for this particular product. You also want to know about that persona's objectives. What is it that they're trying to achieve with your product? Any kinds of worries they have. And then you put in some little like postage stamp background where, this is kind of a typical background for this type of person. So that's an example of a persona. Now, the other elements, so far we've talked about the concept of how the user researcher captures the end user's mental model. They identify who are the key users. They describe that person's journey as it relates to the product. The final thing that UX researchers typically look at would be that particular persona's task flow. And this is really a very simple concept, but it's really kind of like zeroing in a level of detail down from the customer journey. Now, as an example, here's a task flow that you'd want to capture if you were, say, selling printer software or printers. So this would be the tasks that a person goes through when they perform some simplified task, like in this case, changing the ink cartridge on a printer. And, hopefully all of you can relate to this, but you can see it's just step by step by step. Now, business systems analysts are very, very skilled in task flow. They're very skilled in interviewing end users, understanding them, segmenting them. So a lot of the skills that a business analyst has, as I mentioned earlier, are directly transferable into user experience research. Now, the first technique that I'd recommend that you play around with if you're trying to integrate usability into your organization is the user walkthrough. And this is a very, very simple approach. And this is basically you watch the person do the task. You watch one person do the task, you watch 10 people do the tasks. And you watch these users who represent different personas, maybe in different contexts, performing the task. And you document that. And you take that knowledge, and this is where you would give that knowledge, you have a way of reporting it that's very clear and crisp, and you share that information with the software development team, and they're going to use that in the design of the product to make sure that they understand what the user is trying to achieve, what is their task flow, what are the kind of variations on the theme that you commonly find. This is something that you really need to capture if you want to incorporate usability into your technology. Now, I'm going to throw a little bit of lingo here, and aside from what I've already thrown at you, within usability land, we talk about formative user research and summative user research. Formative, as the name suggests, would be that phase of the project at the very, very beginning, like the requirements phase, where you're identifying those personas, aka end users, you're identifying their key tasks, you're identifying their customer journey. Through all of these interviews, and a lot of it's basically going to their environment, sitting down, watching them do stuff, noticing the context, noticing the important details of that context. Well, all of that insight is what the user experience researcher does. And he or she will carry that information back to the team and give it to you, and that gets melded into the product requirements. So this formative stage is really the beginning stages of software development lifecycle. And these are some of the things, some of the sort of key things that are accomplished during this formative stage. Once the design is in place, and the design can be something still pretty primitive, like paper prototypes if you're dealing with software programs, or if you're looking at some kind of physical product, it could be foam core. But basically, the designers have taken all of that user insight provided by the UX researcher and created a product with it. And it doesn't have to be fancy. Well, what the UX researcher does is they then go into what we call the summative phase. And the summative phase is where you actually have a design and you're showing it to those end users that you've identified, and you're asking them to do tasks with that design, and you're just kind of seeing how well that design stands up to reality, real world use. So that's the summative phase. So formative and summative. Okay, so another thing that I want to show you about, because you may have heard of, like a couple of years ago, there was this big buzzword, design thinking. Well, this was developed by IDEO, which is a very high-end product development company, probably in the early part of the 2000s. And these are the bubbles connected. This is the process of design thinking. So empathize is where you actually go out, you learn about your end users using the techniques that I've described up to this point. Then you take that information back and work with the team, typically like in a workshop fashion, where you kind of make sense of it. You might create those personas. You sort of take it and form it into a format that that's relevant to your organization. And then what happens is a smaller group of people will ideate on all the insights that have been gained and structured and reported. And the designers will produce the prototype. Okay, so everything up to this point is formative. And then once you have that prototype, then what the user researcher will do is usability test that prototype iteratively over and over and over until either you run out of budget or you run out of time, or maybe you just, in the luckiest case, have optimized the design to the point where it's as good as it's going to be. And hopefully that's nirvana. Now, formative research, again, this is the front end, is very open-ended. It uses these types of research techniques typically, and this is what you learn through being a user researcher, and this is what I teach in my classes here, depending on the needs of the client, whatever types of skills make sense in your environment. And when you take that open-ended user research, you're using some kind of a rough prototype, and it can be something really, really silly, but you're really, the prototype has as much detail as you need to be able to gather feedback on one or two design questions. So this is formative stages. It's still kind of, it looks a little hokey, but that's by design, because you can get very, very great feedback in these early stages for very low cost before you've done any kind of implementation. Now, summative research, that is, once you have something that's a more hard and fast design, the goal of the summative research, as I mentioned, is to road test the design. And this is where you use benchmarks, and you watch people as they perform tasks. You notice what they can do, what they can't do with the design. Does the design make sense? Does it match their mental model? Is that the way they would do the task flow? These are sort of typical things that you're looking for during the summative phase, and you want to be able to test with all the personas that you've been able to establish in your formative stages. Summative is typically, this is where you have to put some investment in, because you're looking at a real design, something that's really interactive, and it's much more detailed. So a lot of the design issues have been worked out. Now, the method you use for this is called usability testing, and that's where you have people do specific tasks against a more fleshed out design, and you mark off where they succeeded, where they failed, what confused them, what seemed cumbersome, this type of thing. But it's all in the spirit of optimization. Now, here's some good reasons for running a usability study. There's tons of them, and always you should usability test early and often. So here's an example. So the heart and soul of any kind of usability study is the task list, and it's always deceptively simple. So you have, this is a normal task flow for ordering a pizza from Pizza Hut, for example. So you would have people do task 1, then do task 2, 3, 4, and 5 as they, go along the road to ordering their pizza. And as the usability researcher, what you're doing in the background is you're marking off whether they succeed or fail at each of these steps. And then after you've run this study with, say, 10 people who are, represent your different personas, you have some really good data in terms of how this design should be modified and refined so that it works for the end user. Now, here's some components you need to get started if you want to integrate this usability process, introduce this usability process into your software development lifecycle. Very basic things, but actually quite a bit of work. First of all, you need certain people with certain types of skills, and as this field has evolved, these skill sets are pretty much standardized. First of all, you may want to start with a UX usability researcher, and then ideally a second role, which is the person who actually designs the interfaces. That person's typically called user interface designer, UX designer, or something of that ilk. Now, in terms of a process, you want to, this is the tricky part, because you have to have very high level support in your organization. When you're introducing a force like usability into an organization that has no background in this, you definitely need to have, you need to have somebody at a very high level kind of working that UX process into the software development cycle. because you now have the voice of the customer and the UX researcher who's impacting how design decisions get made. And sometimes this creates a lot of, kind of growing pains in an organization. But these are some of the process pieces that you need to make sure are covered. So, you want to make sure you've hired people who have the right skills, or you've trained up people so that they can be competent in these basic skills so that they can get credibility. Now, the third piece, which requires investment, would be operations. So at a very minimum, you want to have a place to run these studies. Conference rooms can work, but sometimes, it makes sense to build a lab. You also need to have facilities there to be able to have the team watching these user studies so that they can see them, because that's a great way to make sure everybody absorbs who the user is and where they might have had issues using the product. Then you also, just from the research side, being able to carry out these studies takes a fair amount of work and coordination. You need to recruit the people. You need to identify who they are, and that flows from the personas you've created. You need to schedule them. You need a place to put all the data you're collecting. You need moderator guides, training, this sort of thing. So there is quite a bit of investment and a shift in mindset that needs to happen in order to be able to do one of these sessions. Now, here's a famous diagram from one of the founders of usability, Jacob Nielsen. So this is Jacob Nielsen's usability maturity model. And he actually created this probably, maybe 30 years ago, but I think it might still apply today. So the other thing that you'd want to do before embarking on, a UX program, a UX research program and design within your organization, you'd probably want to figure out where your organization falls in this model and then plan your strategy accordingly. And make sure it's a good one. Make sure that you go in a spirit of doing the right thing, but doing it in a very competent way so that this skill set is accepted and actually becomes part of the norm of how you carry out business when you're developing software. Now, if you want to delve deeper into this topic, here are some public classes at ProTech that I'm going to be teaching over the coming months. I'm also available for custom training, and I've done quite a bit of this through ProTech. And please talk with Tim and the folks there if you'd like to schedule for either. Now, that basically is everything I've wanted to talk about, and I thank you all very much for being in this webinar. So, do we have any questions?
We do have a couple, Kay, and I'll just go ahead and dive right into them, all right? How do you handle recruiting participants for a usability study? Is it best to bring in outsiders or to use internal people?
That's a great question. Well, it really depends on your resources. There's pros and cons. Some usability testing is better than none at all. And sometimes, especially with software development, what you have is more very, very sort of products that are designed for specific types of users who have very specific knowledge. So in that case, it might make sense to recruit people from inside the organization. Also, you don't need to pay people from within the organization as much as you would, pay an outsider. As you might imagine, though, typically you want whoever is doing your usability study, whoever's giving you those insights, to be objective. So that's a good reason to not use internal people. And they also don't necessarily reflect your typical user. So you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons. But I would say overall, you're better off with people outside, but there's more cost involved. There's more, effort in terms of going out and finding these people, and more time. So it can take, 3 weeks to a month to find a good panel of, say, 10 people who match the precise end user personas that you're seeking.
Excellent. Thank you. Could you explain the difference between usability and user experience?
That's another good question. I think these terms are used interchangeably. Sometimes, it's kind of a word salad situation, buzzword salad. Lately, user experience is used more than usability, just, to describe this skill set. So user experience has to do with kind of the big, broad, a lot of times, some people might think of user experience as being kind of that big, broad sphere around the user that includes their journey, it includes their mental model, it includes their task. So the term user experience is more all-encompassing, whereas usability might be more focused on whether or not the product design is actually intuitive.
Okay, thank you, Kay. I have two questions left. So for everybody that's left in the audience, if you have any questions that we have not asked, don't hesitate to go ahead and shoot them into the question area. The first, again, of the two that I have left, do you really need to bring in both user researchers and user interface designers, or can one person do both jobs?
Okay. Well, just from the sake of sheer workload, it's really advisable to have two different people doing the work. Some people, and as this field evolves, some people are just more skilled. People are more, they spend their careers as researchers versus designers. So you may actually have a harder time finding somebody who is more of a unicorn and has both types of skills. But if you just want to start with a pilot and you can find somebody who can, say, do usability testing, do a good job with usability testing, and is a great designer, then yes, you can have one person doing both. But bear in mind that person at a certain point is going to need some support.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kay. And my last question, where do you find people with UX skills?
Oh, dear. Okay, well, the first place that I would recommend turning to would be the Usability Professionals Association, and the name of their website is uxpa.org. It's an international organization, and they have a jobs board. So they, as an employer, you could you could go there and you could see what the job descriptions are for these various roles, and use those job descriptions to, kind of customize one for yourself. So that would be a good place to start. Also, you can look locally. So there's probably like a usability, like in Boston, we have the Boston Chi, and we also have a local chapter of UXPA. So, and they send out newsletters periodically with job postings. There's also another source called EPIC, EPIC. Those folks are more geared towards ethnographic research, but more and more, I'm starting to see, I'm a member of all three of those organizations. I'm starting to see more job postings for people who are UX designers and UX researchers as well.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm out of questions. Again, I thank you for your time. I thank you for everybody that came in attendance. We still have quite a crowd out there. So most of the folks have stayed all the way to the end. Again, as we've got on the screen through Kay's slide, opportunities to delve a little bit deeper into what we've discussed today. A little teaser for next month's webinar. We run these webinars on a monthly basis in a variety of topics in and around the IT space, and that information is available off of our research tab on our website. Additionally, all of our past webinars that have been recorded, you could view from there as well. So with that, again, our thanks, everybody, and have a great day.